Welcome to the Flame Tree Myth and Fiction podcast.
Faeries and Fate. Mischievous tricksters or benevolent guardians. Fairies crop up in mythology time and time again, but their morality can never be taken for granted. Maybe it's not a question of good or bad, but what the fair folk stand to teach us about ourselves. Today's stories do exactly that, scrutinising the effects of human ambition once messy fairy magic gets involved. Today's first story has been borrowed from our epic fantasy collection and is called Weave Us Away. This one was written by Nemma Wollenfang, a talented author who is also being published in our upcoming romantic fantasy series. Her story today, though, is about fate and what it means to change it. Let's hear from the author before we dive into the reading.
Hi, I'm Nemma Wollenfang, author of this episode's story, Weave Us Away. Flametree has asked for a little introduction, so I'm here to tell you a bit about me and the upcoming story. I've been writing professionally for over 10 years now, with a few prize wins and over 50 short stories published in various venues, across a range of genres. This has included appearances in places like Abyss and Apex magazine, Zombies Need Brains, Titan Books, and Chicken Soup for the Soul. Mostly I focus on speculative fiction, perhaps as a result of years in the laboratory cackling like a mad scientist during my MSc. And a large amount of those stories have appeared in Flametree anthologies. Among them, Weave Us Away. Weave Us Away is primarily a story about oppressed young women taking back control of their fates, acting against the status quo to live the lives they want, but in a subtle way. The story focuses on Rhiann, a young girl coming of age in a fantasy world where the futures of girls are woven for them into sashes. Once Rhiann receives her sash, it's not what she wants, so she takes action and reworks her future. With this one, I wanted to write a story that focused on quiet strength, on quiet rebellion, a story that doesn't take place with sword and shield, but with needle and thread, where victory is contingent on strength of mind and character instead of physical prowess. The inspiration for Weave Us Away actually came from a competition prompt for the Stratford-upon-Avon Literary Festival way back in 2017. The theme was sharing stories, and this was what popped into my head. And while my hastily penned entry didn't actually win the contest, it was highly commended by the judges and made its first outing in the Winners' Anthology, which briefly appeared on the shelves of their Waterstones. Soon after, with a bit of polishing, it found its forever home in the pages of Flametree's epic fantasy short stories anthology, among their gothic fantasy range, as you know. It's been one of my favourite stories to create, so I'm glad to be sharing it with you today. I hope you enjoy listening to it as much as I enjoyed writing it.
By now you're probably all ready to hear the first story, so I'll just quickly introduce a new podcast narrator that's joined the Myth and Fiction team, Sabrina Robinson. She's an award-winning American actress, and I think you're going to love her reading of Weave Us Away by Nemma Wollenfang.
Weave Us Away by Nemma Wollenfang. Avenia was a weaver of tales, the finest there was. She wove all the tales of the girls in our tribe, from highborn to low, from shepherdess to chieftain's daughter. Whenever one came of age, Avenia would pluck 3 hairs from their head and cloister herself away in her hut for 3 days and 3 nights. When she emerged, it was with a sash that depicted their future. Many a time, my cousin and I would sneak out to the weaver's hut, peeking through a high window to watch as she mixed dyes, saffron and indigo, woad and vermilion. Add a dash of romance, the weaver would mutter as she blended. Yes, yes, peppered with daring and sprinkled with gallantry. Mustn't forego that sprig of caution. Stir well. Pungent scents rolled out of her cauldron, vapors from the heady concoction she brewed within. They made our eyes droop and giddy giggles bubble up from deep inside. Then Lavinia would choose the thread, unique for every girl, and head to her loom. But that was only a part of it, for the weaver worked in many mediums. Such marvelous fabric she had, from the finest leathers of the southern deserts to the costliest satins of the eastern kingdoms, in all hues and shades, earthy moss and rich sepia, poppy scarlet and the jet black of beetle shells. Lavinia kept her own spiders and silkworms, and sometimes she even tanned her own hides, for the warrioresses to be among us. It was rare for a girl to become such, though last autumn one had joined the hunters as predicted. Her sash had been made of stiff brown leather. Another, whose sash had been constructed of scale-like discs that shone silver in the sun, had grown to be the tribe's most notorious fisherwoman. Once, Lavinia even wove a sash of pure silk. I had been enraptured by the way it shimmered, making orbs of light dance across the dry thatch of the great hut's roof. Gold and blue, but not just any blue, royal blue. The girl was to be an empress, and not one moon had passed before the emperor himself came to fetch her on his brilliant white charger. They'd ridden away into the sunset. With every emerging piece, we would gather around the great hut's fire pit and hum and coo over the newest girl's designs, caressing the swathes, admiring such exquisite work. So, when I finally received my very own sash at the age of 16, I had high hopes. Too high, apparently. The colors were dim, but still present in patches. The material was not coarse, but it was not made of soft wool either. A very staid but comfortable story. "You are to be a lyre player," Lavinia announced. "Not a great one, but you'll string a fair tune. It will be enough to please the man who weds you, and you will bear him 3 braw sons." I tried a smile, mumbled "thank you," and moved away, disheartened. I did not show the other girls my sash that night. When I ignored those who inquired, they let me be. Instead, I sat before the fire, alone, watching the red and gold flames leap as I held the cloth, letting it flutter between my fingers. A simple life, one of quiet domesticity. It wasn't a bad tale, all things considered. There were no frayed edges, fraught with peril. There were no dark stains of unspeakable happenings, and it was not cut short. Its length was reasonable. A well-woven life by any standard. A good one, pleasant. But it was mundane, too, monotonous and unremarkable. I did not want that, not at all. And I had no wish to learn to play the lyre. As I thought on it, the idea rooted in, anchoring, taking hold. No, this was not the story I wanted to live. It was wrong. It was not me. There was no adventure, no passion, no masquerades or swordplay or epic sea voyages to faraway lands. I wanted, no, needed those things, or at least the chance of them. When I told my mother my woe, she simply sighed and stroked the stray hairs from my brow. "Oh, Rianne, I am so sorry to hear that you are unhappy. But now it is woven, the future is set in stone, each thread already tied. Best to accept what is and learn to be content." I listened to her advice and tried my best to be a grateful, dutiful daughter. I tried not to complain, but something about what my mother said gnawed at me. It took a while to place what. Then it struck, like a flame to a wick. The future was not set in stone. It was rendered in fabric, in stitch and weave. It had been sewn, and sewing could be unpicked, reworked. The idea was staggering, revolutionary. It even scared me a little. No girl in spoken history had ever changed her story. All accepted their tales as they were told to them. Well, perhaps it was time for that to change. Perhaps I could be the first girl to reweave her future. I already knew what to do. My mother had taught me the ways of needle and thread at a young age, and I had watched the weaver at work for years. It was simply a matter of bravery. Did I possess enough courage to proceed? I would have to work in secret. While there was no rule explicitly forbidding what I planned, I was sure it was something that would be, at the very least, frowned upon if anyone knew. That was why I took myself away from the village, over the footbridge, and deep into the darkness of the forest. There was a glen a mile or so in, lit by silvery moonbeams. This, I decided, was to be my sanctuary, the place I would take time to rework my sash whenever I could sneak away. Night seemed to be the best time for that, while everyone else slept. Sitting upon a fallen trunk, I took out my sash. Where to begin? I suppose by unthreading the hem. "What are you doing, Rianne?" For 3 moons, I had had no other company but that of glowing cicadas as I worked in the glen. But apparently, my cousin had seen fit to follow me this night. Her eyebrows rose as she stepped from the shadows. "You're changing your sash!" I kept still as her astonishment ebbed, waiting for any further reaction. Would she run and divulge my midnight activities to the village elders? What would their response be if she did? I was not sure I wanted to find out just yet, not until I was done. Something flickered in my cousin's eyes as they dropped to her own waist, to where her new sash lay. She had been gifted it this very eve, before the great hut's roaring flames. "Mine says I'm to be a sea captain's wife," she said quietly, fingering its perfectly hemmed edge. And by her tone, I assumed congratulations would not be welcome. She came to sit beside me on the damp bark. Close now, I could see the artful depictions of waves, lulling and frothing across the band of velvet, linen, and moth-spun silk. Calm blues, marine greens, seaweed grays, and streaks of turquoise Arctic skies. "My parents were so proud when they saw it," she sighed. "But I have never liked to travel by sea. It makes me so ill. Even when fishing with my brothers in their little rowboat, I cannot stand the rocking." Her lips trembled. "I always hoped I would become a priestess at the air temple, high in the mountains, away from the sea. I have no wish to be a wife." That flicker I had seen, I could place it now. It was an uncanny echo of my own turmoil. "Then why not change it?" I said. "Why not rework your sash as I have done mine?" If anything, my cousin only grew more morose. "I do not know how to." I clasped her hand. "Then I will teach you." As it turned out, my cousin was not the only one who craved some alterations. More girls joined our clandestine meetings, where we shared our stories and what we wished to change. For some, it was not much. A few tweaks here, one less husband there. One wanted to bake instead of cure meats. Another meant to learn the secrets of herbs and become a traveling healer. For some, the changes were much more drastic. Some enhanced ambition with threads of fallow root, giving themselves the opportunity to rise higher than was stated. Others withdrew threads of oak gale that would otherwise have restricted them to lives of quiet drudgery, then soaked their sashes in tinctures of madder or kermes to be sure. A few went so far as to bleach the length of their linens, to begin again after brewing pots of new dye. Some imbued their fabrics with ideas they would never have thought of, or had the audacity to aspire to alone. The rest of us encouraged them along. Our little congregation met under candlelight and starlight, only ever at night. Stealth was key, we decided collectively, in our quest to reimagine our hereafters. It was no small thing, what we did, and for its success we required isolation and time. Now, as soon as the moon rose, half the maidens of the tribe took to the trees, where we sequestered ourselves away, whispering as we worked. Like dryads, I often thought, nymphs of the ancient woods. All was peaceful and companionable in our little forest grove, until, one night, a ringing voice broke through our quiet chatter, shattering it like a hammer to glass. "What are you girls doing?" Silence fell. From the shadows she emerged, with all the willowy grace of a swan, and yet as fearsome as a lioness in her countenance. Avinia, the weaver, had found us. We should have known. With so many of us absconding now, our absence was sure to be noticed. We had become lax in our guard, too caught up in our play at rebellion. As I was the one who had begun this, it was I who rose and curtsied to her. "Weaver," the least I could do was follow etiquette. Those eagle eyes, sharp as flints, snapped to my waist and widened. "Are you changing what I have sown?" The sash wrapped around my waist was now a medley of magma reds and sunburst oranges and cadmium yellows, fiery, crackling, like a spewing volcano. A life of unpredictable possibilities. Maybe I would wed and bear 3 bra sons. Maybe I would not. Now, my future was entirely open to me, my own ship to steer. I held my ground, bracing for her ire. I had no regrets. Stepping closer, the weaver took hold of an end to examine its new style. "You thread a fine tale, girl." Then, raising her head, she looked around at the gathering. "I suppose this means that you are dissatisfied with what I have foretold. Do you all feel this way?" Most stayed silent, avoiding her hard gaze. A few nodded contritely, while others held their chins high, daring her disapproval. She viewed our company with an appraising eye. "Well, if you are going to do it, you might as well do it right," she finally concluded, and rolling up her sleeves, she seated herself on the soft grass. "Hand me that swathe of lace." From then on, a new tradition arose. The weaver ensured that all the daughters of our tribe learned to sew early. Then, when each girl turned 16, Avinia would guide them as they crafted their own futures with needle and thread. And if, as they aged, they found that the style no longer suited them, they would unpick the threads and rework the fabric, weaving a brand new course. After all, the fabric was not set in stone. We were all mistresses of our own fates.
Do we think that the weaver in this story was magical? Was she predicting the fates for the women in this village? Or was she simply stating their current life trajectories? It is possible, I suppose, to read her not as limiting these women, but spurring them on to shape their own destinies. I appreciate the happy ending of this one anyway. To me, it was very inspiring. Perhaps it is important for all of us to sit down and set out the vague shape of our lives and what we want out of it. A manifestation of sorts. Our next story also deals with a character seeking to change their life, but this time ambitions lead them awry. This is a fun morality tale that can be found in our Faeries and Nymphs Myths Tales collection that is releasing this month. From Hungarian folklore, this is The Wishing Skin, read by Shilpa.
The Wishing Skin. Once upon a time, there lived a woodcutter in a little cottage at the foot of an old, gigantic oak tree. He had a wife, but no children, and together they lived humbly but very contentedly. For in front of his cottage he had a nice little garden in which he grew everything that was necessary for their daily food. Fine wheat with which to make bread, and rich fruit and vegetables. He also had a cow which gave him abundance of milk, and sheep that yielded him soft wool, which his wife wove into garments for themselves. One day, a peddler had come wandering past the cottage with pots and pans and other goods for sale. The wife bought a thing or two from him that she needed, and he again went his way. When he had gone, the woodcutter found an old book of tales lying in the road, which the peddler had evidently dropped. He took it home to his wife, and in the evening, when she sat at her spinning, he read some of the stories aloud to her. They were a curious lot of tales, all about fairies and magicians that granted people's wishes and changed woodcutters into kings. That night, the little woodcutter could not sleep a wink. He lay awake thinking of the fairies and picturing himself having one of those godmothers whose only duty seemed to consist in waving their wands and fulfilling requests. In the morning, he went quite dejectedly to his work, quite different to his usual sprightly little self. He chopped the wood with a heavy heart for a time. Finally, he threw down his axe in despair and sat down sullenly on the stump of a tree, wishing at least to see a fairy and persuade her to take an interest in him. His attention was presently attracted by a bright-eyed rabbit which seemed to have suddenly come from nowhere and sat opposite to him, blinking one eye in a knowing way. So absorbed was the little woodcutter in the castle he was building in the air that he never started even when the rabbit suddenly began talking to him. "Well, Mr. Woodcutter, and what can I do for you? You have been wishing to have a fairy godmother ever since last night. Now, though I'm not your godmother, I know a thing or two. For instance, I know where the wishing skin lies, which the little fairies have been weaving for 300 years, and which is now completed. Anyone wearing the same can have every wish fulfilled the moment he formulates it. Of course, as the skin is made of wishes, every time one is fulfilled, it evaporates, and the skin becomes that much smaller. But then, what does that matter? The little fairies have hidden the skin under a lightning-struck willow tree. But I have burrowed the hole, and I know exactly how to get at it. I will show it to you if you like." Thereupon, the little rabbit darted off and presently returned, dragging a large bundle after it, which he spread out before the woodcutter's eager eyes. "And is this skin really made of wishes? Oh, Mr. Rabbit, please let me put it on just for a few minutes. I would like just to make one wish. I promise I will give it to you back directly." The good-natured little rabbit willingly helped the woodcutter to put the magic skin on, which fitted him somewhat tightly, but still it felt pretty comfortable. "Oh, how I wish this skin were altogether mine," sighed the woodcutter, "and that I never need part with it." Hardly had he uttered these words when he felt as if the skin fitted him a shade tighter than before. "Hello," said the rabbit. "What have you been wishing for? Certainly you seem to me to have diminished in size. Here, give me the skin. I must put it back where I found it, or the fairies will be after me." But the woodcutter knew he did not give up his treasure any more. So, looking disdainfully at the rabbit, he stalked off in the direction of his cottage, his head full of plans for future grandeur. But Mr. Bunny, in a great rage, loped after him, yelling with all his might, till the woodcutter, losing all patience, turned round and screamed at him, "I wish you would go to Jericho and leave me alone!" When immediately the rabbit ran away as hard as he could tear, and he felt the skin again tighten round him. He knew that Mr. Bunny had gone to Jericho and would trouble him no more. When he got home, he told his wife his wonderful adventure, but she only thought he had been drinking and advised him to go to bed and sleep it off. When, to convince her, he said, "I wish there was a fine supper table laid all ready here, with roast fowls, roast ducks, and roast turkeys, pies and puddings, and 4 flunkies to wait on my wife and me." Hardly were the words out of his mouth when a most gorgeous table appeared in the center of the room, heavily laden with the most delicious dishes, fruits and wines, while 4 servants in gold and silver livery stood waiting to serve the supper. The wife could hardly believe her eyes, and they both sat down and ate and drank and made merry, for they felt that their future was now likely to be a glorious one. Certainly, the little man felt himself a good bit smaller. His feet, when he sat, no longer reached the ground. But what of that? He would become so rich and proud that his stature would not be of the slightest consequence. So, lifting a glass of wine high over his head, he said, "I wish to be a rich lord with a castle instead of a cottage, and lands and woods all my own. I wish to wear velvet garments, and my wife to go about in nothing but silk dresses. I wish to eat off nothing but gold plates, and use glasses cut of pure diamonds. I wish—" But his wife checked him just in time, for at every new wish he uttered, he diminished an inch before her very eyes. And lo, the humble cottage had disappeared, and they were sitting in a grand hall with marble pillars and soft carpets. They looked out of the window, and though it was evening, they could see distinctly a lovely garden planted with graceful trees and flowers and fountains in crystal basins, while soft music filled the air. The woodcutter looked at his wife, and she at him. Poor little man, he was only 3 feet high now, but he was clad in a sumptuous coat and cloak of velvet lined with ermine. His wife was dressed in a lovely silk gown with diamonds on her arms and neck. They could hardly contain themselves for joy, and the wife, seizing her little lord in her arms, began dancing round the room to the time of the distant music. The entrance of a number of lackeys and maidservants asking his lordship for orders for the night reminded them of the duties of their new position, and they marched off to their bedchamber in solemn state. The next day they spent in visiting their extensive domains, the stables, coach houses, farms, and dairies. They found that they were indeed considered enormously wealthy. Everybody bowed down to them and listened deferentially to all they had to say. The only thing that was very annoying was that the little lord felt that his 3 feet of stature were evidently a source of intense amusement to all his retainers and servants. In the afternoon, they ordered their gilded coach and 6 white horses to take them to pay calls on their neighbors, whom they hoped to dazzle with their great splendor. They set off in most gorgeous style with an army of outriders and flunkies following the carriage. But to their intense astonishment, the various neighboring lords had just as fine houses and gardens as their own, and wore just as fine dresses and magnificent jewels as they did themselves. So they returned home in disgust. Joan especially was intensely annoyed. One lady on whom she called wore 3 more bracelets than she did. Another had 7 more servants, and the third wore a dress embroidered with real pearls, while her own was only embroidered in silver, and one and all had sneered at her diminutive lord and pointed to their own handsome husbands. She wished she could be richer and grander than they were, so that they should be obliged to bow down before her, even at the cost of another foot off her husband's stature. So after supper, she talked to her lord about her grievances and pointed out to him that while he was merely the equal of his neighbors, they would always laugh at him. But once their superiors, say a royal duke or a prince, they would never dare to do so again. At first, Jack refused to wish for anything else just yet. He felt himself quite small enough and did not think that any additional grandeur could compensate him for the loss of another 12 inches. However, at last, his wife prevailed upon him, and just before going to bed, he wished to become a royal duke, second only to the king and equal to any prince in the land. And the next morning, Jack and Joan woke to find themselves in a royal palace, with all the servants in royal liveries calling them their royal highnesses. And all the lords and ladies in the land came to pay their respects to them. Joan was proud indeed. Not one lady wore such fine jewels or had such a number of servants and palaces as she had. And though her husband was now only 2 feet high, all the lords stood round him, loudly laughing at his jokes, and the ladies vied with each other as to who should lift him up into his chair. That very day, the king was himself coming, with the queen and all his retinue, to pay a visit to the royal duke and duchess, and grand preparations were made for His Majesty's reception. When the king and queen arrived, Jack and Joan received them in the grand hall of their palace. Poor little Jack! He felt very nervous when he had to kiss the queen's hand. Joan had to lift him into a chair, which amused their majesties very much and caused a titter among the other royal dukes, princes, and princesses. During the banquet, the diminutive royal duke had to sit on a very tall stool and had to have his food placed on his plate for him, as he could not reach the dishes. The king was quite convulsed with laughter and hardly could eat anything. No one else dared to smile, but the queen made sneering remarks to the duchess about her funny little husband. That night, Joan and Jack had a frightful difference of opinion. She wished to rule supreme over everybody, so that even the king and the queen, who had laughed at them, should have to come to and do homage to her and her husband, whatever be his size. In fact, she wished to become the greatest empress in the world. Whereas Jack felt that another foot off his height would be a trial he could never undergo. However, his wife goaded him on till she had gained her point, and before the sun rose next morning, the woodcutter and his wife became the most powerful emperor and empress in the world. There was not a king or a queen in the world that did not come to do homage before their imperial majesties. No war was declared between any nations or treaty signed without their consent. They exacted tribute from all duchies, principalities, and even kingdoms around. But alas, for the poor little emperor, he was only 6 inches high and had to be carried in state on a cushion to all the great functions and to stand on a gold table when he received the ambassadors from foreign courts. At banquets and state dinners, he had to sit on a little golden chair placed on the table and be fed with a salt spoon out of the empress's plate. Very soon he got tired of all this, more especially as after a little while Joan, now having reached the height of her ambition, took very little notice of him. She wouldn't allow him to have any voice in any of the affairs of state, and grew tired of seeing her husband carried before her on a cushion. Finally, she had a tiny doll's house built in the garden, into which she relegated her lord and master and only took him out to play with occasionally. Poor little Jack! He thought sorrowfully of the days when he was a fine-grown man and cut wood in the forest and was master of his own little home by the old oak tree. He cursed the rabbit, the fairies, the peddler, and chiefly his own blind stupidity in wishing to change his own contented, happy lot for all this gilded misery. At last, one day, looking out of the tiny windows of his doll's house, he saw a woodcutter going along merrily with his bundle of sticks, whistling a lively tune. The poor little emperor took his jeweled crown, which he always wore, off his head and throwing it violently on the ground so that the gems were scattered in all directions, he said, "Oh, how I wish I were a full-grown man, a woodcutter again, with my wife in my own little cottage, not dreaming even of such things as kings and emperors." When he had spoken, in one moment the magnificent palace, the exquisite gardens had vanished, and he sat in his big armchair opposite his wife, who was knitting. His feet touched the ground, and his arm reached to where Joan was sitting. They fell into each other's arms. Was it all a dream, little readers? I cannot tell you, but all I know is that henceforth Jack and Joan lived humbly in their little cottage, contented and happy ever after.
So when I gave this story to Shilpa to read, she asked me, "B, why didn't the woodcutter just wish to be taller?" And I just laughed and said, because that would spoil the story. But now, having listened to it several times whilst editing, I noticed that he did eventually wish to be taller again, when he says, "How I wish I was a full-grown man," at the end of the story. But to him, being tall was synonymous with accepting the cards he had originally been dealt and returning to his old life, suggesting perhaps that there's a maturity in accepting that you can't have it all. I fear that we've presented quite a conflicting pair of stories to you today. One that encourages you to be ambitious and seize control of your own destiny, and the other that warns you to be careful of longing for what you lack. Somewhere between these ideas, a balance must be struck. Personally, I think I'd rather take control myself than leave it in the hands of temperamental fairy magic. We'll see you next week for a more romantic episode, featuring a story from one of our Myths, Gods and Immortals books. Can you guess which one?
Thanks so much for listening. We really hope you enjoyed this episode of the Flame Tree Myth and Fiction podcast and look forward to the next episode. Do recommend it to your friends. Goodbye for now.